Thank you, Mr Speaker. If I were a Labour Party list MP, if I were on the middle backbenches, I would be very, very worried, because what you just heard was going back the default muckraking down in the gutter, and is exactly why they plummeted from 9 years of power to opposition now. And recent polls, like the other one the other night, that is exactly why you, Mr Speaker, they polled so badly at the last elections, with their officials out there going round old documents, mucking round in the gutter, trying to interpret things the wrong way round, spending taxpayers' funds along the way through, trying to dig up dirt on good people of this House who were in this House, and I would be very, very worried. Even before that speech they should have been worried, but if one of the younger MPs that looked towards and just heard what we just witnessed for the last 20 minutes over there, they should be very, very worried, because I see about 5 list MPs over there. Every single one of you is in dire straits, when the public realises that you're back. Some of your front bench members, to be fair, are back to their default position. You should be, Mr Speaker, they should be very, very concerned indeed. New Zealand are tired of it, they're disgusted by it, they have no interest in it, and with recent events it does not reflect very well on some of the more let's say pleasant members on the other side of the House with that kind of rhetoric, Mr Speaker. I am personally quite affronted by where there are avenues to investigate what the previous member was arguing, was suggesting. There are avenues open to every member, and it's actually interesting that the particular member chose not to follow those avenues. The one bright thing about this, the one bright thing about the previous member's speech, was a few weeks ago the Honourable Pete Hodgkinson had a go at our Prime Minister John Key about trust and things. It was all rubbish, it was all a facade, it was all chucking mud, but the best thing about it is when he realised he was wrong, he announced he wouldn't be standing again. Perhaps that's the precedent set, but with Mr Mallard, with what he has been going on about, Mr Speaker. I apologise for the last few minutes of having to go and address that, but it cannot go unaddressed where that's gone. And I repeat again, if I was a newer Labour member, even some of those members that have perhaps been around a while, I would be very, very concerned, because that 30% you saw on TV3 the other night, it's just gone sub-30 as that member will continue. Mr Speaker, the appropriation debate, appropriation and press supply debate, well, Mr Speaker, we inherited a shambles. We inherited quite a shambles. The budget itself, we released just almost a month ago, 20th of May, was actually the budget we would have liked to have produced in 2009, but for the global recession hitting New Zealand's shore, compounding the recession that the previous administration took New Zealand into about 1 year before the rest of the world, Mr Speaker. It's made the job very, very hard. The decade of deficits was a mountain in front of us, rampant and out of control, unaccountable, non-responsive, non-measured, non-transparent spending was just out of control, and there was underlying assumptions of a continuum, exponentially compounding growth in taxation revenue, therefore spend by the public sector, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Finance Minister noted in his speech earlier some of the facts in and around that. Anyone can remember that, because obviously Mr Cunliffe made a speech earlier, and it's obviously proof positive that the fiscal fairies are alive and well there on the other side. The fiscal fairies are at the bottom of the Labour garden, or perhaps in the gutter with some of their members, as we've just heard, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, for example, the budget has to try and address, and has addressed, the concerns, some of the issues in and around Kiwi Rail. I'll come back to asset management in a moment, Mr Speaker. Kiwi Rail, paid for, I think it owes the taxpayer about $1 billion at the moment, maybe just shy of, and actually valued at something like $300 million, I think. And some members of the previous owners have done very, very well indeed out of the New Zealand taxpayer, Mr Speaker. It may seem old news. Bottom line is, let's call it $700 million written off, totally written off, not available for new hospitals, not available for schools, Mr Speaker, not available for roads, not available for energy, and of course, Mr Speaker, announcements in the budget, $250 million of capital gain into Kiwi Rail to try and fix up what was totally and hopelessly broken when the previous Finance Minister totally overpaid for it. And if you wonder how the poor taxpayer was taken for a ride there? Well, Mr Speaker, I understand that the previous administration, whilst in negotiations for Kiwi Rail, in fact called Kiwi Rail to ask for the loan of a locomotive so they could paint it in Kiwi Rail's colours so they could have a press announcement ready. Meanwhile, on the other room, negotiations were going on. Funnily enough, the price suddenly went up, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the finance spokesman from the other side, Mr Speaker, spoke about the need to export. And I quote, and I'm quite intrigued by this report here in the Manawatu Standard, which I actually recently featured in, so it's quite appropriate, Mr Speaker, because I went there recently and spoke to an audience, a paying audience, mind you, of about 35, 40 people. I think they paid to cover costs. I think it was about $25 or $30 each. And the local member there had a bit of a go at me about this and swore black and blue that Mr Cunliffe would be back, but he wouldn't be charging anybody. And we noted that people get what they pay for, and it was of no surprise to anybody else that actually no one would expect to pay to hear Mr Cunliffe speak about the budget, Mr Speaker. Mr Cunliffe spoke to 25 people in Palmerston North. But Labor offers fresh reprieve to GST hike. How is it going to happen? Well, they're going to he said defining fresh fruit and vegetables will be relatively easy. So they're going to exempt fresh fruit and vegetables, apparently, from GST. They had 9 years to do that. When they installed GST from 0 to 10% or increased it from 10 to 12.5%, they never once mentioned or thought about or publicly proclaimed that they were going to exempt fresh fruit and vegetables. He said, excuse me, Mr Speaker, he said, Mr Speaker, and this is where I actually agree with him, the New Zealand economy suffered, he used the past tense, not the current, suffered from a toxic cocktail. And I quote, we don't export enough, we don't innovate enough, we don't save enough. Well, hello, the solutions after 9 years, we don't export enough. Anyone remember Export Year? That was the solution. Talk about it, make some badges, put some pamphlets out. Remember Export Year? Actually, exports plummeted, Mr Speaker, and as the Finance Minister shared with us in his earlier speech, actually the export sector, the real sector of the economy, the part of the economy that actually creates jobs, creates wages, keeps family in their homes, in their mortgages, has been in recession since 2005. In recession to 2005. Quite how that stayed under the radar for 3-ish years, I really don't know, Mr Speaker. I find it somewhat surprising. So now this budget is trying to address that, to rebalance the economy, to rebalance our export incentives, to real incentives using the levers of taxation and better forward cash flow of investment, Mr Speaker. Also the access to credit. The previous speaker said there was nothing in the budget. Well, actually, the 09 budget he was talking about at the time got New Zealand a global credit rating upgrade. Now, when you owe the rest of the world about $180 billion, it's pretty important to try and keep those rates as totally low as possible, Mr Speaker. An earlier speaker also talked about their solutions. They are going to have a look at monetary policy, Mr Speaker. They are going to have a look at monetary policy. Well, they seem to forget that in the last Parliament, initiated by the previous Finance Minister on FEC, there was an inquiry into monetary policy. And I'm quite surprised that those people over there who have read lots of books about the economy, but not necessarily partaken in the economy, know better than the learned people that came before FEC with many, many years' experience from across the spectrum and actually said, hey, it's the best we've got right now. We think it's doing a pretty good job, Mr Speaker, and not many of them seem to have read the price targets agreement, Mr Speaker, which we noted the other day during public session at the committee. One final thing, as the Honourable Peter Dunn alluded to, in the article there in the Manawatu Standard, it looks like Labor's bringing in a capital gains tax. Looks like they're going to campaign on a capital gains tax. Well, OK, let them go out there and do that, but note, everyone's property's fallen by about 10 to 20, even 30% over the last few years with the global recession. So Labor are going to campaign on taxing to catch up in your property. They are going to try and put in a capital gains. All that you're doing is trying to catch up where your valuation's been over the last few years, Mr Speaker. I'm looking forward to them campaigning on apparently axing the tax, but I don't know where the bus has gone, bringing in a capital gains tax and raising income tax levels up to higher than they were prior to this budget, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Before I call Dr Kennedy Graham, I think there was